After an introduction like that, you don't know where to go, do you? I grew up on a farm in rural Australia where my father always said, the bigger the hat, the smaller the property. Kind of goes with introductions as well, doesn't it? Longer the introduction, Anyway, I'll let you work on your imaginations for that. Could I begin by acknowledging the First Nations, whose cultures we celebrate, on whose lands we meet. And in Australia, it is my custom to acknowledge the first Australians, whose lands we also meet on and whose cultures we celebrate as one of the oldest continuing cultures in human history. Could I also acknowledge the Business Council of British Columbia, as well as the BC Chamber of Commerce. I understand there are members of the provincial legislature and members of the provincial government. I acknowledge them as well. And to all you good, fine folks for being out of bed this early of a Friday morning on a bright, fine and sunny Vancouver day. That was irony, by the way. It's good to be here. It's good to be back in Canada. It's good to be back in BC and good to be back in Vancouver. For those of you who know Australia well, when we think of Canada, we basically identify it co-equally with British Columbia. We think these are actually coterminous concepts. We think the capital of Canada is Vancouver. I'm sorry, most Australians haven't heard of Victoria out there on the island. Therefore, it's a great discovery for most Australians that there is a Canada which actually abuts the Atlantic Ocean as well. I remember my first visit to Eastern Canada was, in fact, would you believe, last June, when my good friend, the Canadian Foreign Minister, John Baird, invited me there. And I discovered there's actually quite a lot of activity out there as well, as well as a capital. I'm often asked, how did I get into the business of Asia and China? For my sins at university, I learnt Chinese when most people were starting to become lawyers or doctors or accountants. I thought I would try and understand something about one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And I've often been asked how I managed to do that. Any of you come off farms here in this part of Canada? Stick your hands up. Okay. I had this existential conversation with my father as a 10-year-old, where he said to me, I remember, on a horse one day, he said, well, Kev, he said, have you made up your mind, the big decision in life? What you're going to do? The pathway looms before you. And I said, Dad, I'm not quite sure what you mean. And to which he said, the big decision. Are you going to have a future in beef or in dairy? And so I kind of thought China was a safe remove from both those propositions. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. The subject you've set for yourselves today is a great subject. It's a question of how you in Canada and you here in British Columbia engage the dynamic future that is Asia. And I'm happy to share some thoughts with you on that. We in the Antipodes claim to have no monopoly on wisdom. Our circumstances geostrategically and geoeconomically have been somewhat different to yours. For us, the events of the Second World War were primarily an Asian phenomenon. And though we had fought with Canadians in the First World War and the Second, our primary theatre of engagement was frankly an existential one in Asia. And since then, both in foreign policy terms, security policy terms, and in the last 35 years in economic terms, we have seen our destiny as lying in the Asian hemisphere, which we regard to be our home. And so for us, this region, once regarded as foreign and exotic, has now become quite familiar. And for us, there's been no set of national alternatives. And therefore, through our own process of trial and error over the last 30 years or so, we have taken a series of steps which I think have assisted our own long-term national interests in engaging the vast opportunity, diversity and challenge that represents 21st century Asia. A few thoughts on Australia and how we see our identity in the world and the region. Then I might say a few things about where Canada and Australia are in fact quite similar. We in Australia would see ourselves as a country which is a middle power in the world with both global and regional interests. Globally, like yourselves in Canada, active in the councils of the United Nations. We're currently serving on the Security Council. Active in global institutions like the G20. Active in other institutions, even like the Commonwealth. But regionally, where core national security and economic interests lie, also, for us, our bread and butter in the neighbourhood we call Asia. And for us, this has never been a question of either or, it's always a question of both. When I look at Canada and Australia, there are remarkable similarities. According to the stats I saw last night, you rank somewhere between the 8th and 10th largest in the economy in the world. We're the 12th largest economy in the world. Canada, the population in the mid-30 millions, ourselves 23 million. Countries which have strong, diverse and modern economies. Countries which have increasingly, as you see evident most particularly in this province of British Columbia, diverse multicultural societies. Countries which are also proud of their Indigenous heritage and their First Peoples. We bring, therefore, a formidable array of strengths to the table. And if you travel the world as much as I do in positions past and present, you begin to appraise afresh what a formidable array of strengths we have. And we should never diminish those, including in our own domestic political discourses. These are great countries with great and strong economies, independent legal systems, robust democracies, despite their episodic engagement in what could be described as comedy and farce. Nonetheless, these are formidable strengths when arrayed against what is on offer in many other parts of the world. Even at a state and provincial level, when I look at provinces like British Columbia and my own home state in Australia, the state of Queensland, we face the Pacific, you face the Pacific. My state of Queensland has a population of 4 to 5 million. We represent about 20% of the Australian economy. Here in BC, you're 4 to 5 million, you represent 12 or 13% of the national economy. We therefore have a number of commonalities which cause us to reflect often with one another about how we engage with the challenges of the neighbourhood. Which brings us to what I've been asked to talk about, which is firstly, how Australia has engaged the Great Asian Project over the last 30 years or so, and then secondly, what, if any, lessons we have learnt from that, to the extent that they are in any way useful to our friends in Canada, here in British Columbia, and in the good city of Vancouver. For us, beginning 30 years ago in the 1980s, we reached a conclusion unless we radically internationalised the Australian economy, we were on the road then to, frankly, emerging third world status. A dramatic statement, but frankly, if you look at the rigidities of our economy back then and our failure to embrace a complete policy posture of openness to the global and regional economies of Asia, that's where we were headed. So beginning with the governments of the early 80s, we began a radical process of opening the economy. Opening the economy in terms of what we did with the currency market, what we did with interest rates, what we did with, frankly, the reduction of protectionism virtually to zero, and then as an Australian Labor government, a very difficult enterprise, given our strong and historical connection with the Australian trade union movement. But on top of that, a vigorous implementation of domestic laws of competition policy or antitrust to make the economy as robust and as globally competitive as we could. And on top of that again, we then faced challenges in the last decade of how do we build on those strengths which saw us progressively engage with the economies of the world and the region, but to do so more competitively in the 21st century as well. We had matched our economic opening with a radical reorientation of our foreign policy, whereby we saw comprehensive engagement with Asia as, frankly, one of our 3 core objectives as a nation. Now, the platform of the Australian Labor Party, which I represented as leader, has as its foreign policy platform 3 core objectives. 1, our alliance with the United States. 2, our membership of the United Nations. 3, our policy of comprehensive engagement in Asia. And broadly, that's a set of priorities which extend across the Australian political spectrum. But a foreign policy orientation is one thing. Having a globally oriented economy which is open and transparent and with marginal restrictions to trade was still not enough. In the last decade, we've had to embrace a further set of reforms as well, to continue what we would describe in our country as the productivity revolution. Of course, for us, this is critical when you're confronted with the extraordinary richness and depth of the human capital that is available in modern Asia. In the last 5 years, we've begun what we've described in Australia as an education revolution. What do we mean by that? A single national objective to turn Australia into the best skilled, best educated, best trained workforce that you'll find anywhere in the world. And a radical program of investment in our education infrastructure. Such things as ensuring that every preschool in the country is formally taught pre-literacy and pre-numeracy skills so that these provide a proper foundation for the primary schools and secondary schools. A radical investment over the last 3 years, partly as a stimulus strategy response to the global financial crisis, to ensure that our primary schools are equipped with modern 21st century state-of-the-art libraries firmly and totally wired to the outside world. And also providing our schools, our primary schools, with the opportunity to twin with schools right across Asia using the opportunity of high-speed broadband. Our secondary schools, a radical investment in state-of-the-art language schools, state-of-the-art science laboratories to ensure that they are also up there in the global and regional competitive circle. And on top of that, again, to ensure that when it comes to what is also fundamental to our national competitiveness, an investment in what we call vocational education and training through the construction of new trades training centres to support all of the nation's 2,500 high schools to ensure that we have the best qualified tradespeople that we will need for the 21st century. A radical parallel investment in our universities. The objective here, and it is a long-term project, the investment in human capital, is to ensure that we have the best educated, best trained, best skilled workforce in the world, when ultimately we will face a proposition where it will depend on the skills of our people and little else in terms of how we compete in the global economy of the future. That's been one arm of our productivity revolution. The second